how much trouble is Europe in long term?
Well, long term, I think they really have to balance their portfolio. There's a move toward 2030 and 2050 goals. We all understand that. We think it's important to continue this energy transition. But nonetheless, you have to balance your portfolio. So natural gas is going to be an important part of what they do to meet those goals 2030, 2050. So again, I'm glad to see them moving that way. But you point out a very important aspect of this whole plan, if you will, between the United States and the EU. These gas cargoes are subject to private contracts. So the ability to move 15 BCM in the case of what the president announced we're going to do really depends upon the private industry and the ability
to. She doesn't necessarily have a good relationship with, at least not in the United States.
Dan, do you think prior administrations could have done a better job, though, at trying to guarantee and protect European energy security? Because, I mean, you were sitting in your office for a long time. We've seen Russia continuing to be a problem for the United States for a long time. This was an issue that was brewing away in the background. No one did anything about it.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if we could have done any better job, so I don't want to get into a political conversation around that. I think it's important, though, to recognize that what we were saying 3 years ago was important. It's very, very important that you balance your portfolio. We called it all of the above because we wanted all forms of energy, renewable energy, solar, wind, you name it. We think that's important as well because when you look at the history of energy, it's always been in transition, but it's always been a transition of less to more. It's not really been a transition of this versus that, this type of generation versus that type of generation. To maintain the economic growth that all of these countries want, that the United States wants, it will take more energy, not less. That's the transition that we should focus on, and that's what's going to get us to a place where we have energy security as well as national security, not only for Europe, but for the United States as well.
The world's going to need as much energy as possible in the future, right? Which is why we're having this conversation now. Right. Dan, to another point though, what did you make of the president's gaffe in this speech in Poland, and how do you think it's going to be viewed in Russia?
Well, I think it depends on who he was talking to. So I'm not quite sure if he was talking to the allies, if he's talking to Mr. Putin, or if he's talking to some other audience. I can tell you the Russians may react to this very negatively. These things are somewhat problematic at times. They can have a tendency to embolden the populace. So look for the reaction of the Russian people, not so much Mr. Putin, and we'll see what happens from there.
Yeah, I wonder about this actually because I spoke over the weekend as well with the CEO of Total Energies, Patrick Pouyanné, and I was pressing him pretty hard to account for himself. At the end of the day, we've seen BP and Shell and a plethora of other companies, oil and gas and others, leaving Russia en masse. I mean, it was a very early on decision taken, for example, by BP. They were the first major, and they wrote down, $14 billion as a result of that. Right. And essentially, Patrick was saying to me, these assets are going to be there whether I decide to get out of Russia or not, and I have a fiduciary responsibility to my shareholders. This is how he explained this to me, to not just walk away and sell them at a loss or sell them to oligarchs, which would then continue to prop up a regime that we're supposedly sanctioning and we want out. He said, I'm not going to work with Vladimir Putin again. Does this create, in your view, like a conflict, or rather a conflict of interest, when you have these companies that are major taxpayers in various countries unable to exit Russia?
Well, Patrick's right. He does have a fiduciary responsibility to shareholders. I can understand that. The question, though, what happens long term to those assets? He may be operating them today, but he may not own them tomorrow. And that's really the risk that he has to weigh as the CEO of Total. And I can't really speak to his internal situation because I don't know it. But when you look at this long term, those are the types of risks that you look at. And the question is, how long does he stay there?
Yeah.
Or does he stay there?
How effective have the US and Western sanctions been against pushing back on Russia? We've seen this exodus of Western companies, but companies that you wouldn't expect to be pulling out, I guess making a statement about their commitment to Western ideals, like McDonald's and MasterCard, for example. How effective is that in actually pushing back as an act of deterrence, an act of punishment?
I think very effective. I think very effective. I think the Russians may have underestimated the amount of activity around the world, with regard to these types of sanctions. We've thought about sanctions in the past as financial sanctions, looking at the oligarchs, freezing assets, doing the more traditional things. I don't think that they anticipated the lack of access to ATMs, the lack of access to McDonald's or Big Macs. Yeah. Those are the types of things I think they underestimated, and those are the types of things that the public, the populace in Russia are going to react to. So the question is, regarding the president's comments, regarding these types of sanctions, what do the Russian people do and what do they say and how do they act next? Not so much what Mr. Putin does, but what do they do?
Dan, I want to tap into your experience about how you actually see us getting out of this situation. Do you see a pathway for de-escalation or a pathway to escalation from this point on? Because we've been told to expect, a protracted war with Ukraine. It seems that's the way it's going.
Well, that's been the diplomatic corps. If you look back in history, look back at World War II, look back at the Vietnam War, the diplomats would always have quiet conversations, and what they're doing in many cases is trying to develop off-ramps so that people can gracefully exit from the situation that you find yourself in. I'm not quite seeing that in this case. It may be occurring and I'm just not familiar with it, but that's what we need to look for is what are those off-ramps?
That's exactly what the Turkish foreign minister was saying to me. Essentially, we know they hosted those talks. I was there in Antalya a couple of weeks ago when the foreign ministers met there. I spoke to Lavrov. I also spoke to the Ukrainian. And he was saying we want to find some kind of a graceful exit. It seems to me that the two major points of contention at this moment are the status of Crimea and the status of the Donbass. And that seems to be that's the major sticking points at this point. But I want to ask you, before we let you go, does this kill the energy transition, at least in the short to medium term, the energy crisis that we're in? I mean, everybody can talk a big game, but does it kill the energy crisis? And do companies, for example, or private equity groups like BlackRock have to really take a step back and think about the fact that they decided for ESG and shareholder reasons, under shareholder pressure, to go green as opposed to traditional financing of fossil fuel investment and all of these things? Is that a mistake in retrospect?
Yeah, well, I think they're going to recognize that the transition is more than just going again from natural gas or fossil fuels to 100% renewables. It's going to be adding new energy, and natural gas is a part of that. And I think as we take a step back and look at this transition, will it continue? Will the decarbonization goals continue? Yes, they will, because that's where the public is going. But it's going to include some of these fossil fuels. Natural gas is the perfect complement to many of the renewable technologies that are coming online in Europe and the United States. So I think you're going to see companies take that step back and reevaluate. Maybe it's not 100% renewables in the short term. It may not even be that in the long term. It's going to include some of these other, what we call base load generation type fuel sources. You're going to see those come back to the fore as they balance the needs between their carbon goals, decarbonization goals, and their energy security.